everybody, welcome to another video from the 67 Stang channel here. So, a lot of stuff I want to talk about today. Today's a very important day for me personally, and I want to talk a little bit about some events that were very pivotal in my life and me growing up and being who I am today. But before we get into that, I want to show a couple of neat things that I've got here that have happened. So y'all may remember in some past videos where I'd gotten, or my dad had actually found the original sales receipt for the Mustang when he and my mom bought it brand new in Beaufort, Georgia back in March of '67. So a good friend of mine, David, framed this all up for me. Y'all may remember me mentioning David's name because he's also the one that has loaned me his blast cabinet, sandblasting cabinet that I've used on cleaning up a ton of parts for this car before I paint them and all that. So godsend, highly recommend having one. So I want to thank David for the blast cabinet and for doing such a wonderful job on getting this framed. Now I just got to figure out where I want to hang it. So I thought that was pretty cool. Sit down here. The other thing is my book. Y'all have seen me mention this in some of the other videos where I talked about writing a book and all that. So it's finally done. This is now my third book that I've written. So this is on ArcGIS Pro, which is software that I use as part of my professional career to create maps, do analysis, all this computerized stuff. So it is now out and available. You can get it from Amazon and whatnot. Anyway, not trying to sell the book, but trying to sell the book. So there we go. So very excited to have that done. Okay. So those are all great things that happened, but not really what I wanted to talk about today. So this is going to be different. And I know I've done some other non-Mustang videos, but this one's important. 30 years ago today, I was in the U.S. Navy and serving on board the USS Saratoga, which was an aircraft carrier stationed out of Mayport, Florida. God, the flies are bad. Really ruining the tone of the video. I was an operations specialist, which meant I worked in our Combat Directions Center, which also used to be called the Combat Information Center, or CIC. You've probably heard it talked about in movies and things like that. So on this day, 30 years ago, I deployed for the first time. And what was originally supposed to be a traditional med cruise, anybody that served in the Navy knows what those are, especially on the East Coast. But for those that don't, back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and early 90s, during the Cold War, the U.S. Navy regularly, and they still do actually, deployed both out to the Mediterranean for supporting NATO allies, as well as did Westpacks. So around Japan, Korea, the Philippines, Thailand, and all those other kind of places there. And it was just a rotating schedule where, you know, there was always a carrier deployed to that. So it was our turn to do that. And then a week before we were supposed to deploy for that same deployment, many of y'all probably remember, some of y'all may not be old enough to remember now, our good buddy Saddam Hussein decided that he needed more beachfront property on the Persian Gulf. The only problem is there's this little thing called Kuwait that was in his way. But he figured, I guess, that, yeah, it's a little country, who's going to care? I'm going to invade it. And so he did. And that happened a week before we were supposed to deploy for our traditional deployment. So what was expected to be a traditional, fun, hit a bunch of med ports, go see topless beaches, drink beer because there was no drinking or different drinking or whatever, turned into a very different experience. So I wanted to kind of share that with y'all, what my experiences were, talk about that a little bit, and hopefully you'll find this interesting. Gives you a little more input or information about me and whatnot. So here to help jog my memory, I've got what is called a cruise book. This is like a yearbook, but for a ship, and done for every deployment that they go on. You can see the thickness of this book because this was an aircraft carrier. So to give you some idea of the size, I've actually bookmarked some facts so I remember them because there's a lot. So for those that don't know, or probably most of y'all don't, is the Saratoga was actually was the first class or part of the first class of supercarrier, being the forestall class. And what that meant is, opposed to other carriers that were built during or just after World War II, is she was designed from the get-go with all of the aspects that you see in modern U.S. Navy aircraft carriers today. So they have the angled flight deck, handled jet aircraft, and arresting wires, and catapults, and radars, and all that kind of stuff. The Saratoga was actually commissioned in 1956. She was laid down in 1952. So even by the time of Desert Shield, Desert Storm, she was an old ship, right? So she was not a young ship by comparison there. So with that being commissioned in 56, just to give you an idea, she was 990 feet long. So that's over 3 football fields long. She had a beam or width of 129.5 feet. Her flight deck, where the aircraft landed and launched, were set 176,729 square feet in area. The hangar deck underneath that, where we stored and repaired aircraft and all that, was just over 75,000 square feet. Now, let's see if they have her weight, her displacement. There we go. She displaced over 78,000 tons when fully loaded. So that's a pretty big ship. We had, with Air Wing on board, over 5,000 men serving on board. And at this time it was all men. This was before women were allowed to be on combat vessels. So it was all men. We carried over 90 aircraft on board. It was a combination of fighter aircraft, attack aircraft, early warning aircraft, anti-submarine aircraft, and helicopters. Okay, so a lot of, we were a floating city. We had laundries, we had stores, we had obviously galleys or mess decks for feeding the crew, berthing space for 5,000 plus guys. I think we had, I don't know how many we had in our berthing space, but we were all stacked 3 high in our bunks and whatnot. So that was the ship. When we got ready to depart on August 7th, and here's a picture of us departing, let me see if I get this up better, Mayport Naval Station. Which camera's going to capture this better, so I'll hit both of them. Today, 30 years ago. I said we didn't know what we were getting into. Most of us were fresh out of high school. The one saving grace I'd say we did have is that our skipper, we got a truck going by. It's loud for a second. Anyway, sorry. I'll get you back. Our skipper, Captain Mobley, Joseph Mobley. He was a Vietnam veteran. He had actually been shot down over Vietnam and spent time in the Hanoi Hilton. So we had a good experienced skipper with us. And I'll tell you right now that he instilled a level of trust in us, and not just with him, but within our own capabilities, that was phenomenal. I really think he made it so we had such a successful operation in there. So very, I'd follow him to hell and back still to this day. He's an amazing man and a great leader. So, yeah. So, we got ready to deploy. We got started heading over there, and this is where the first story I want to tell comes in. So we're going across there, and they want us to get there as fast as we can because no one knows what Saddam's going to do. Is he going to take Kuwait and then lose that to go into other countries like Saudi Arabia? Is he going to use that to go off into Iran? Who knows what he's going to do? He's a crazy madman. So we're going across the Atlantic as fast as we can. So we're going flank speed across. Now, a carrier, when we deployed, is accompanied by a battle group made up of multiple ships, right? We had what they call Aegis cruisers, Ticonderoga class. They provided the core of our defense. They had the most advanced combat weapon systems on board. We had Spruance-class destroyers, which were there for anti-submarine protection there. We had frigates that were in there to also assist with anti-submarine protection and to be early warning pickets for the battle group. We had an air defense cruiser with us. We also ended up with the USS Wisconsin, which was a World War II era battleship. Reagan brought those back as part of the 600 ship fleet that he was doing during the Cold War. And all of us were going across. When we deployed, and keep in mind most of those, the Ticonderoga class cruisers, the Spruance class destroyers, the frigates, most all of those had been built either in the late 70s, early to mid 80s. And so they're all brand new compared to the Sarah, which was built in 56. So as we're going across at mostly our top speed, all of those new ships weren't able to keep up. We were outrunning them. And think about that, a ship that is longer than 3 football fields, going faster than lighter, smaller cruisers, destroyers, and frigates. The only ships that could actually keep up with us was a 60s built air defense cruiser called the USS Biddle and the USS Wisconsin, the World War II era battleship. Those were the only 2 ships, as I recall, that could keep up with us as we went as fast as we could, within reason, across the Atlantic to get into the Mediterranean and heading for the Persian Gulf region. So I thought that was kind of neat, that here we are, one of the oldest ships in the fleet, and we're outrunning some of the newest ships in the fleet, and only some of the other older ships in the fleet could keep up with it. So I thought that was kind of cool, personally. Plus, I'm a big fan of the battleships. It's part of the reason I joined the Navy. I love history, and battleships always fascinated me, and that's really what I wanted to serve on, was a battleship. Of course, I got a carrier, but that's the Navy for you. So that was the first thing. So we get over there, we go through the Suez Canal. We ended up setting a record for the number of passages through the Suez Canal in a single deployment. We went through the Suez Canal 6 times, which was very interesting. Not just the number, but the thing with the Suez Canal that was somewhat troubling, actually, is there were certain parts of it you could literally walk to one edge of the flight deck, look down and see land, walk to the other edge of the flight deck, look down and see land. That's not usual. Seeing land on one side, yeah, it happens. You pull into port all the time, that happens. But to see it on both sides of the ship, a little disconcerting. Okay, so that was kind of neat. So we get into the Red Sea, where we spent most of that deployment. We did go, obviously, through the Suez Canal 6 times, so we went in and out a couple of times. And we ended up being one of 3 carriers that were there in the Red Sea. It was us, the JFK, John F. Kennedy, CV-67, and the America, which I believe was CV-66, in there. All 3 of us operating in the Red Sea. So there's a couple other things that ended up happening. So one of the things that happened is once Desert Shield became Desert Storm, our aircraft, of course, were in the very first sorties that went in to attack Iraqi forces. And as a result, we also had the first combat kill, meaning one of our aircraft actually was one of the first, or was the first, to shoot down an enemy aircraft. So that was good. We also had the first combat casualties of the conflict. Commander Spinnaker, I think I pronounced that right, was flying an FA-18, fighter attack aircraft, and he was shot down over Iraqi territory. The sad thing about that, aside from obviously him being a casualty, was his body was not recovered until well after the war. Matter of fact, I don't think it was recovered until 5 or 6 years ago. So his family really didn't know if he was dead or alive, because they listed him originally as KIA or killed in action. Later he was MIA and whatnot. So that, obviously brought stress on there. Other things that happened, obviously, when we were there, that I remember distinctly with talking about those that were shot down or whatnot. We did have some aircraft that were shot down, and one of our aviators, Lieutenant Jeffrey Zahn, was captured. He was a bomber navigator out of a A6 Intruder. Those that were around at the time may remember when Iraq was actually showing those prisoners on camera, and Jeffrey Zahn was one of the ones they showed. Now, if you remember, he was all beat to hell. His face was all cut up and scratched up and all that. And of course, the news crews initially said, they alluded that it might be treatment by the Iraqis. It wasn't that. It actually happened when you punch out of an A6, as I understand it. And anybody that's an A6 pilot that may know differently can correct me on this. But the canopy doesn't eject. Like a lot of more modern aircraft, the canopy will actually blow out and then you eject up. With an A6, you actually punch through the canopy. And that, as I understand it, is what caused his injuries. Now, and if anybody knows Lieutenant Zahn, or if he happens to see this, or I'm going to apologize if this bothers you or not, but he was not highly thought of by those of us that worked in CDC when he would stand watches as one of the officers in there. He was kind of a jerk. So we, before we realized what had actually caused the facial injuries, and I'm sure other injuries, because his arm may have been a sling and whatnot, but we thought he probably brought it on himself, being a jerk to the Iraqis, giving them a hard time, which is what he should have done as a POW, right? But we weren't surprised if he had been beat up by the Iraqis because of that. So anyway, I said, God, a lot of things happen, and I don't want to bore you with these, but some of these are really being the 30th anniversary. These things spring to mind. One of the things that really happened that was not good for sure was while we were over there, our combat information system went down. So I'm going to show you here. Okay, so here's, first off, for those that can see it, I am, let me see, where am I at? That's me right there. I'll do both cameras. Okay, so that's me. But you can see these are the consoles that we worked on. Going wrong. Nope, going the right way. So we worked in the CIC with these radar consoles. Here's the officers in charge. All of these you can see working on. That's what we tracked the radar contacts on. That's what the officers viewed our situation, operational situation or whatever you want to call it, and got the tactical picture on, all those things. It was all controlled by a computer, and in 1990, when all this was going on, and into 91, that was the top of the line combat information system for an aircraft carrier. We had just gone through a refit before all this, although she was built in the 50s. She was very modern as far as her combat suite, her sensor suite, and all that. But while we were there, the whole system went down, crashed hard. Got the proverbial blue screen of death like you do with Windows nowadays. And all our backup disks were destroyed. So, what do? You're the flagship of the fleet. How do you handle this? What do you do? Well, The advantage of being built in the 1950s is that the Sarah was built before all this techno stuff was in place. They had left all of the old style plexiglass boards. If you've ever seen World War II movies of ships like, say, Tora Tora Tora, that kind of thing, where you got the guys writing on the plexiglass screens from behind and all that, the Sarah still had those. A lot of them had been set on swivels so they could hang up into the overhead or the ceiling. So we had to drop all of those down and basically go back to the 1940s and 1950s way of doing things. Where we're using grease pencils, and actually had to go down to medical and get some tongue depressors to make rulers to scale so that when we picked up a radar contact, we could actually measure the distance it was from the ship on the radar screen. So that was kind of fun, actually going back. And we'd luckily been trained in our A-school training to do this. We had to dust off a bunch of cobwebs, but we were able to do it. And I thought that was pretty phenomenal to know that even losing all that technology, that we could still get out there and function, do our job, still launch and recover aircraft and all those things. So that was pretty exciting there. The Biddle I mentioned, she lost her rudder at one point there during the deployment. I remember that. And I always had this joke that there was some engineer down in one of the engineering spaces walking along, tripped over some bolt on the deck. Said, gosh, this isn't the way, we need to get rid of it. Let's loosen it up. And he unloosened the bolt and the rudder fell out. That's not what happened. I don't know why the rudder fell out, honestly, but that was the vision I had. I thought that was kind of funny. Also on that deployment, we had 3 Steel Beach picnics. So for those that are not in the U.S. that may watch this, that may be served in other navies of other countries, the U.S. has a strict no drinking policy on their ships. They don't allow any alcohol in normal conditions. If you get caught, it's big trouble. But we did have these 3 Steel Beach picnics, and that's basically we get up on the flight deck, the Steel Beach, and they cook out hamburgers, hot dogs, but then they also will give you a beer ration. You were supposed to get 2 beers per person. So we had, to get that, you actually have to be at sea for a total of 30, I think it's 25 or 30 days. I'm trying to recall from memory. It was 30 years ago. And we had 3 of those. So that was a pretty interesting thing. But probably for this cruise, there was one very memorable event, and not necessarily for a good way. We got relieved by one of the other 2 carriers and was able to go back through the Suez Canal up into the Mediterranean. And this was right around Christmas time. It was December 20th to the 28th or something like that. We were supposed to be in port in Haifa, Israel, getting some R&R, doing some repairs to the ship, and so on. And of course, being there in Israel at Christmas in the Holy Land was pretty special. I'm not a very religious guy myself, but even for me, that was pretty special. The problem with an aircraft carrier, because of our size, we often can't pull directly into port. I mean, we can't go pier side because a lot of the piers aren't designed to handle a ship on that side. So we would anchor out in the harbor, and we'd have to get ferries to transport people and supplies back and forth to the ship. Well, it was December 23rd, somewhere around that neck of the woods. Well, see if I can remember it specifically here, because I actually bookmarked this. It's not that one. Where? Oh. December 22nd. I was on duty, luckily. We were experiencing very rough seas. The sea state was, I think, 10 to 12 foot seas, with going higher. I don't want to say gusting because that's not the right term, but occasionally getting higher than that. And so you can imagine, you got a carrier, it's at anchor, but it's still floating. At the back of the ship, on the very stern, we have what they call a accommodation ladder. It's a ladder that drops down, and they had tied up a barge basically to the back of the ship. And ferries would come dock with that barge, offload sailors, onload sailors, offload supplies, so forth. So you get the idea. Okay? But the ship's moving, the barge is moving, and the ferry's moving. So you get three objects all moving. Not always together. So that night, I had just gotten relieved from my watch up in CIC. And had gone down and gotten into my rack. For those that don't know what a rack is, it's where you sleep. Think of it as bunk beds. And it had just gotten ready to go to sleep because it was late. And all of a sudden I hear through the ship's announcing system, man overboard, man overboard. Man overboard off the stern. Emergency muster. Anyway, you don't need to hear the actual naval thing. I still remember it after 30 years. It's pretty amazing. And I'm like, we're in port. Man overboard? This is silly. I'm not getting out of my rack for this. So I don't get out of my rack. And then not long after that, I don't remember the exact time frame between all this because honestly that night is still a blur to me. I hear mass casualties on the fantail. Away the medical response team, and I don't remember the rest of that one. And that got me out of my rack. That is not something you want to hear while you're in port during a holiday season. There's nothing good about that because there was no word drill in front of that. It was a true event. Still get choked up thinking about this. But I went up to combat, CIC, we called it combat, CDC, to find out what was going on. That was my muster station in the event of emergency. And I get up there and there are guys on radios, there's traffic going back and forth. And what I found out is that apparently one of the ferries that was waiting to pull up and offload sailors had sunk. And to describe these ferries, they were double deckers. You had a front cabin, or a front, it was steered from the front. Then there was a cabin on the main deck. It was enclosed with windows, doors. And on top of that was an open air deck with more chairs and things for guys to sit on. And I said this was December. So a lot of the guys were inside because it was cold. It was wet. So imagine being on that and it starts to sink. Guys were trapped. It didn't matter if they had life vests on or not. It didn't matter. They were stuck. Obviously, we started immediately rescue procedures. Got helos in the air. Put boats in the water. And we pulled a bunch of sailors out, but we didn't pull all of them. 21 shipmates went down on that ferry. It's one thing to lose men in combat like Commander Spinnaker. You expect that. You can handle that. Not that it's easy, and those that have lost men in combat, friends, but to lose somebody in that kind of freak accident is hard. And one of the guys that went down was a friend of mine. I won't say he was a good friend, but he was a quartermaster, Petty Officer Delgado. He ended up getting the Navy and Marine Corps Medal. He was one of those that did get off initially. But he was diving down and he pulled several sailors out of that enclosed cabin that got them saved. And he went down one more time and never came back up. I don't know that I would have had the courage to do something like that. I'd like to think I would have, but I don't know. And I thank God I've never been put in that situation. But there were a lot of brave men that perished in that. And it's probably one of the worst things I ever had to deal with. I remember standing watch in CIC as this was going on, and I ended up having to relieve the petty officer that had relieved me, because when they came over the radio and announced the first casualty and who it was, and it wasn't Petty Officer Delgado at the time. I don't remember the name, but they gave his social security number and all that. He really just lost it. He couldn't deal with it. So I had to relieve him back and take over the watch and coordinate things. It was a very hard day, but here's a picture of the ceremony that we had several days later for those men that perished. And it was probably the hardest service I've ever been through. Then close after the loss of my mother and grandmothers, grandparents, all that here. Now, kind of as part of that story, and I know this is getting long, but several days later we were able to go back ashore, and weather had improved and everything like that. But a bunch of my shipmates and I went. We got a hotel room at a hotel in Haifa. And from there we started making calls home because we hadn't been able to get off the ship. And yes, there was notifications being done by the military and all those kind of things. But again, keep in mind this was 1991, or 1990 rather, when this happened. And we didn't have the technology, the instant communication, all that we have now. So my parents really weren't sure whether I was alive or dead. They felt that they hadn't heard anything. I was probably okay. My fiance then, and I say fiance, yeah, we were technically engaged, but we were kind of having a rocky period. She wasn't sure that she wanted to deal with the Navy life, and because at the time I was thinking about making a career. Didn't know. So from there I was able to call home, and it was Christmas Eve their time and Christmas Day our time. I think that's the way that worked. Or it was the day after Christmas our time. Anyway, it was, you get the idea. So I was able to get to my parents first and talk to them. And my dad still swears that that was the best Christmas present he's ever gotten, was that phone call. I also got to talk to my fiance and now wife. And she's later told me that that was pretty much made her decide that she, whatever it took, was going to stick it out. The fear of losing me showed her how much she really cared, and the thought of not having me in her life scared the crap out of her. And so she decided that, which leads to another funny story. So we're going to tell a funny story now. After that, here in Atlanta, the local news crews, and I'm sweating like a pig. It's hot out here. Local news crews were doing little snippets on the nightly news about various soldiers, sailors, and Marines that were, and airmen, don't forget the Air Force, that were deployed then. And so they did one on me. And apparently, I didn't know this was going on. My fiance, now wife, told everybody in Atlanta that she hoped I made it home for our wedding, that she was planning to be on March 8th of that year, of 91. So all of the city of Atlanta and surrounding area knew I was getting married before I did. And I started getting letters from pen pals. Y'all may remember the Any Soldier, Any Sailor letter writing campaigns. So I developed a couple of pen pals. As a result, started congratulating me on my upcoming nuptials that I didn't even know about. So that was kind of funny. We didn't end up getting married on March 8th because I wasn't back home then. But we did get married later that year. As a matter of fact, our wedding anniversary is coming up at the end of this month. So it'll be 29 years this year. Because of anyway, get that. So that was kind of fun. So anyway, there's a lot more stories I could tell. That one cruise really shaped my life a lot, made me grow up and become largely the man I am today. Because as anybody that served the military, I think, can understand this, is you're forced to grow up. You may be surrounded by men and women now that are in your city, fresh out of high school or fresh out of college, and don't have a lot of life, but you will there. You are expected, you have to, in order to get the job done, to keep yourself safe and keep your fellow service members safe. So the next big day, and then I'll close this out, I remember it's the day we came home. And it was March 28th is when we came home. And it was amazing. We came home to a hero's welcome. People were on the pier. Maybe see the gathering here. I'll try to find a better picture and add it in here. Just pier was full of family and friends, news crews, out at the entrance to Mayport, which those that may not know where Mayport is, it's down in Jacksonville, Florida, right there at the mouth of the St. Johns River where it goes into the Atlantic. Boats out there, honking their horns, balloons everywhere, helicopters, blimps. It was, I can tell you, we were manning the rails. Now, actually, when this was taken, I was down below deck because I was part of the radar navigation team, so I couldn't be up here yet. But I can tell you there wasn't a dry eye on this ship. 5,000 grown men, all crying because we were happy to be home, and we were just overwhelmed at the support that those we had left behind had given us, not just coming home, but throughout the course of the entire deployment. You know, we'd grown up hearing stories of those coming back from Vietnam, with the civilians spitting on the soldiers and sailors and Marines and airmen, all that. So we didn't expect anything like this. One of the guys that served with me was also a Vietnam vet, and I'm not just talking about Captain Mobley. We probably had a large number of Vietnam vets on board at that time. But one of them was formerly in the Army, and he was a tunnel rat. Those that don't know what that is, Google Vietnam tunnel rat, and you'll find it. But his reaction to this homecoming was beyond words, and I'm not even going to try to describe it because I couldn't come close to doing it justice. I can tell you, for me, it is a day that I will never forget. Next to my wedding day, I think that was the biggest day in my life, even over the Haifa incident. Seeing all those people, I remember trying to get up to the flight deck as fast as I could once they secured the radar nav team to see all those people. And then when they started getting the brows are the gangways that get you on and off the ship. Once they started rushing down to my berthing space, getting my stuff together because I had been approved for leave right then. And I remember I knew my fiance, now wife, was going to be there. I hoped my mom and dad would be there. I couldn't see them in the crowd, but I remember they started calling away Liberty calls. And Liberty call, all, you know, first off was all new fathers are granted liberty. They go. And then they started doing it by rank. And so I was an E5, which is a second class petty officer. For those that are in the Army and Marines, it's a sergeant, 3-stripe sergeant. So I wasn't one of the last ones, wasn't one of the first ones. When they got to me, they had a bunch of these browse. They were doing by alphabetical order. I remember coming down the hangar bay and looking at the A through D line, and it was huge. Again, trying to remember getting 5,000 people off the ship. And I looked down at the XYZ line, for last names again with XYZ, and it was short. I ran down to that line. They weren't checking IDs. I got off, I got in that crowd, and the first person I located was one of my wife's best friends, who ended up being her matron of honor, Tyra. And seeing her, giving her a hug, and like, "Where's Polly? Where's Polly?" And she's like, "She's somewhere." And all of a sudden, I get tackled, and it's Polly there just wrapping me in a big old hug. And I don't know how long we stood there just holding each other, but I said, very emotional stuff. It was just the best feeling. And then my dad, my mom were there, and my mother-in-law was there, and getting all those hugs and all that, and getting in, walking the car and leaving the base, and just people lining the streets, cheering us on, waving for us. You know, I've never been more proud to be an American, to have served my country than I was that day. So anyway, I just wanted to share that with you because it is the 30th anniversary. I hope I haven't bored you too much with all of this, but it's stuff I wanted to share. If y'all don't like it, then hopefully members of my family will enjoy this and remember this. If you served in Desert Storm or have some memories or things, please share them in the comments. I still keep in touch with a bunch of my shipmates thanks to Facebook and whatnot. And you know, that's the one thing I can say. I served with men of all races, sizes, religious backgrounds, economic backgrounds, ages, and they were all great. I mean, sure, some had issues, but who doesn't? We're all humans. But it was my honor to serve with each and every one of them. I didn't care. And I'd do it again. So, with that, guys, again, I hope you liked it. Make sure to subscribe to the channel. I promise the next video will be on the Mustang. You can see a big box here. Some pretty important parts came in with that. So we'll get back on that. Again, give us a thumbs up if you like it. Thumbs down if you don't. Leave comments. You know the drill. And with that, guys, I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.